My name is Mitchell. I'm 52 years old, and I've spent the last 12 years building a life for a daughter who wasn't mine, only to watch her dismantle my dignity in less than 60 seconds. Standing in the middle of a crystal-lit ballroom in Richmond, Virginia, I watched Paige raise her vintage champagne flute. She didn't look at me. She looked right past the man who paid for her Ivy League degree and her designer gown, locking eyes with Dominic, the biological father who hadn't sent a single birthday card in a decade. "To my real dad," she announced, her voice echoing through the silent crowd of Virginia's elite, the man who finally showed me what true family looks like. The room erupted in applause, but the real blow came afterward. As the music swelled, Paige pulled me into a dim service hallway, her eyes cold and transactional. She leaned in, her perfume cloying, and whispered, "Don't embarrass me tonight by acting like you're part of this family. The Julians expect class, Mitchell. Just stay in the shadows, keep the wine flowing, and make sure you settle the $35,000 tab before you leave. You're a provider, not a parent. Know your place." I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I just felt a door inside me lock forever. If you want to see how a man with nothing left to lose takes back everything he gave, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss how I turned her perfect engagement into a legal and financial nightmare she'll never forget. 12 years ago, this house in Richmond was nothing more than a collection of dusty rooms and a mountain of inherited debt. I remember the day I married Sarah. She was a woman drowning in the financial wreckage left behind by a man who had vanished into the night with a suitcase and a drained bank account. That man was Dominic Vance, the biological father who had effectively erased himself from Paige's life when she was just 12 years old. Back then, Paige was a frightened girl with scraped knees and a habit of hiding behind the curtains whenever the doorbell rang, fearing debt collectors. I didn't just step into the role of a husband. I stepped into the line of fire. My first act as a stepfather was to take my savings money I'd earned through grueling overtime as a structural engineer and clear the $40,000 credit card debt Dominic had racked up in Sarah's name. I did it without a second thought, because I believed family was built on sacrifice, not bloodlines. As the seasons blurred into years, my life became a series of invoices dedicated to Paige's future. I was the one who spent 3 consecutive weekends building a custom mahogany bookshelf for her room so she would have a quiet place to study. When she turned 16, I didn't just buy her a car. I spent 6 months researching the safest mid-size sedans, eventually settling on a pre-owned Volvo that cost me $18,000 in cash. I wanted her to feel secure, a feeling her biological father had stolen from her. The most significant commitment, however, came during her senior year of high school. Paige wanted the best, and in her mind, the best was a prestigious private university with a tuition tag that made my eyes water. Sarah cried, knowing we couldn't afford it, but I told her to dry her eyes. I signed the papers as the sole financial guarantor for a $95,000 student loan package. I didn't just sign a document. I tethered my financial freedom to her success. For a decade, Paige called me Dad with a warmth that felt like a reward for every dollar spent and every hour sacrificed. We had a routine every Sunday involving local brisket and discussions about her architectural dreams. But the atmosphere in our home shifted 6 months ago when a series of flashy notifications began lighting up her phone screen. Dominic Vance had re-emerged, not as the bankrupt coward who fled, but as a self-styled international venture capitalist, according to his meticulously curated social media profiles. He started small, sending her a $3,000 designer handbag that arrived in a box so shiny it made our living room furniture look cheap. He followed it with grand, empty promises of $1 million wedding in the heart of Europe and a trust fund that would make her real elite. Dominic didn't show up for the graduation ceremonies or the late-night flu scares. Yet suddenly, he was the only name Paige wanted to speak. She stopped asking for my advice on her career, choosing instead to parrot Dominic's buzzwords about passive income and social standing. Sarah noticed the change too, but she was so terrified of losing her daughter's affection that she became a silent observer to my erasure. Every time I tried to point out the lack of substance behind Dominic's claims, Paige would roll her eyes and remind me that I was just an engineer who viewed life through a calculator. The transition was agonizing to watch. I went from being the man who saved their lives to a mere utility company that was expected to keep the lights on while someone else claimed the glory. The warmth in her voice was replaced by a cold, transactional tone that hinted at the betrayal brewing beneath the surface of our daily lives. The first crack in the foundation of our family appeared 3 months before the engagement party, manifesting as a simple, cold request over a Saturday morning breakfast. Paige sat across from me, her eyes fixed on a glowing tablet screen that displayed a seating chart for the upcoming celebration at the Jefferson Hotel. Without looking up, she slid a printed guest list toward me and cleared her throat with a rehearsed precision that made my stomach churn. "Mitchell," she began, the name hitting me like a physical blow where Dad used to reside. "We need to be realistic about the optics for Julian's family." I watched her pen hover over the head table, the place where I had expected to sit as the man who had funded every deposit for this event. She explained, with a chilling lack of emotion, that Dominic Vance had offered to fly in a small group of his investor friends from London to bolster the family's social standing. To accommodate them, she had decided to move my name to a circular table near the kitchen doors, reserved for distant cousins and business acquaintances. I looked at Sarah, hoping for a flicker of the woman who had promised to stand by me when we were building this life from nothing, but she only studied the pattern of her lace tablecloth. "It's just one night, Mitchell," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with the fragile hope that silence would buy her daughter's happiness. "Dominic has such a grand presence, and Paige just wants to impress Julian's parents. They are high-profile attorneys. They expect a certain level of pedigree." The word stung, a sharp reminder that in their eyes, my 12 years of structural engineering and steady paychecks were suddenly less valuable than the gold-plated lies of a man who had only returned once the heavy lifting was done. Paige didn't care about the 16-hour days I'd spent on construction sites to ensure her trust fund remained untouched. She only cared that my calloused hands didn't match the silk tie aesthetic of the life she was trying to inhabit. By the time the final rehearsals arrived, the erasure was nearly complete. Paige had stopped mentioning my role in her upbringing entirely when she was on the phone with Julian's mother. I overheard a conversation in the hallway where she described her father as a man of international mystery and wealth, while I was relegated to the status of a family friend who helped out during a difficult transition. When I confronted her about the blatant lie, she didn't apologize. Instead, she stood her ground with a frightening level of arrogance. "You were a bridge, Mitchell. You did what a good man was supposed to do for a woman and her child, but you aren't the destination. Dominic is my blood, and blood is what the elite in Richmond understand. You should be happy I'm even letting you attend." The psychological shift in our household became a suffocating weight. Every dinner conversation was dominated by Dominic's supposed connections and the extravagant lifestyle he promised to provide once the wedding was over. He had convinced Paige that my insistence on a budget was a sign of my limited mindset, a way to keep her tethered to a middle-class existence that she was now too refined for. I found myself walking through my own house like a ghost, watching Sarah meticulously iron Dominic's favorite brand of shirts, while my own laundry sat forgotten in the dryer. The woman I loved had become a stranger, an accomplice in the slow-motion theft of my identity. I realized then that they weren't just taking my money. They were attempting to rewrite the history of my life, deleting every sacrifice I had made to make room for a man who hadn't even been there to see her lose her first tooth. The betrayal wasn't a single event. It was 1,000 small cuts, each one deeper and more calculated than the last. The gold-leafed ceiling of the Jefferson Hotel ballroom felt like it was collapsing onto my chest as Paige's whisper faded into the roar of the jazz band. Her hand, manicured and cold, gave my arm a final, dismissive squeeze before she turned back to the crowd, her face instantly shifting into a radiant, performative smile for Julian's parents. I stood frozen in that dim service hallway, the scent of expensive lilies and floor wax suddenly nauseating. She hadn't just asked me to stay in the shadows. She had stripped me of my humanity in front of the very people I was subsidizing. I looked at the folded white slip of paper she had shoved into my hand, the mid-evening balance for the open bar and the premium seafood tower, a staggering $15,000 that she expected me to settle like a loyal servant before the night ended. I walked back into the main hall, my footsteps silent on the plush Persian rugs. Dominic Vance was at the center of a circle of guests, holding a crystal glass and regaling the senior Julian with a fabricated tale about a vineyard in Tuscany he supposedly owned. Sarah was standing beside him, her hand resting on his sleeve, laughing at a joke I knew she didn't understand. She didn't look for me, not once. It was as if my 12 years of presence had been a flickering candle that they had finally, collectively, blown out. The realization didn't bring tears. It brought a terrifying, crystalline clarity. I wasn't their family. I was their line of credit. And every line of credit has a limit. Instead of heading to the coordinator's desk to swipe my card, I made my way to the coat check. I retrieved my trench coat, the heavy fabric feeling like armor against the humid Richmond night. I walked past the mahogany bar where the bartender was popping bottles of $300 champagne on my account. I reached into my pocket, took out the unpaid invoice Paige had given me, and placed it flat on the marble counter next to a half-eaten appetizer. I didn't sign it. I didn't add a tip. I simply walked out through the heavy brass doors and into the parking lot, the valet offering a polite nod that I didn't return. The drive through the empty streets of Richmond felt like a fever dream. My phone began to buzz incessantly in the cup holder texts from Sarah asking where I was for the family photo, followed by a frantic message from Paige demanding to know if the payment issue at the front desk was a mistake. I ignored them all. I navigated the car toward a brick professional building on the edge of the fan district, where a single light was burning on the third floor. Arthur Sterling, my oldest friend and the sharpest estate attorney in the Commonwealth, was waiting for me. I had called him 10 minutes after the real dad toast, my voice so steady it had frightened him. When I entered his office, the smell of old paper and stale coffee was the first thing that felt real in hours. Arthur didn't ask if I was okay. He knew me better than that. He just pointed to the leather chair across from his mahogany desk, where several folders were already spread out. "You're sure about this, Mitchell?" he asked, his spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose. "Once we trigger the clawbacks and the contract terminations, there's no going back. Sarah will be collateral damage." I looked at my hands, the hands that had built their world and felt nothing but a cold, rhythmic pulse. "The bridge is gone, Arthur," I replied, my voice sounding like gravel under a heavy boot. "I'm not just going back. I'm erasing the path behind me." For the next 4 hours, we worked in a silence, broken only by the scratching of pens and the hum of the office printer. We weren't just looking at bank accounts. We were deconstructing a decade of generosity. We mapped out every asset I owned in Richmond, the house, the vehicles, and the secondary tuition accounts. Because I had never legally adopted Paige, a choice she had made herself at 18 to honor Dominic, she had no legal claim to a single cent of my estate. I watched as Arthur drafted the revocation of the financial guarantee for her final semester's specialized master's program. I signed the documents to freeze the joint credit cards and initiated the process to remove Sarah's name from the corporate housing lease I had provided for her boutique. By the time the sun began to peek over the James River, I wasn't a provider anymore. I was a ghost with a very expensive legal team. The sunrise over Richmond was a cold, unforgiving gold when I finally walked out of Arthur Sterling's office. I didn't go back to the house in the suburbs. Instead, I drove to a small studio apartment I kept near the university district for late-night project deadlines. By 6 in the morning, my laptop was open, and the digital deconstruction of Paige's lifestyle began in earnest. My first call was to the regional director of the bank that held the co-signed loan for her final semester of graduate school. I informed them, with a voice as flat as a structural blueprint, that I was formally withdrawing my status as a financial guarantor effective immediately. The clerk on the other end sputtered about interruption of studies, but I simply reminded him that under Virginia law, my obligation ended the moment I filed the revocation. I wasn't just stopping a payment. I was pulling the plug on her academic prestige. By 8 o'clock, I initiated the recovery protocol for the white Lexus SUV. Paige drove a vehicle that was technically a corporate lease under my engineering firm. I tracked the GPS to the driveway of the Jefferson Hotel, where she had apparently spent the night in a luxury suite, likely expecting me to cover the $300 room service bill. I sent a remote command to disable the ignition and dispatched a private towing service to reclaim the asset. I could almost imagine her standing under the hotel's portico, designer heels clicking on the pavement, watching her status symbol being hoisted onto a flatbed truck while the valet looked on in confusion. It wasn't about the car. It was about the mobility I had provided, a mobility she believed she had earned through birthright rather than my labor. The silence of my phone was finally broken by a deluge of notifications that felt like a swarm of angry hornets. Sarah was the first to reach out, her voice on the voicemail sounding thin and brittle, a stark contrast to the laughter she had shared with Dominic Vance just hours prior. "Mitchell, the bank just called about Paige's tuition, and her car won't start. They said it's being repossessed? Where are you?" "We're still at the hotel, and the manager is saying the banquet bill is outstanding. They won't let us leave with our luggage until someone pays the $15,000. Please, just pick up." I listened to it twice, not out of guilt, but to confirm that the reality of their choices was finally setting in. They had spent 12 years treating my bank account like a natural resource, and they were shocked to find the well had gone dry. I didn't reply to Sarah. Instead, I sent a single, formal email to Paige, CCing the law firm representing Julian's family. In it, I attached the scanned copies of every major expenditure I had made on her behalf over the last decade, from the braces on her teeth to the security deposit on her luxury apartment in the Fan District. I stated clearly that, as of midnight, my role as a utility provider had officially expired. I informed her that the lease on her apartment would not be renewed at the end of the month, and that the utilities, which were in my name, would be disconnected in 48 hours. I didn't use words of anger or betrayal. I used the language of a contractor closing out a failed project. The most surgical strike, however, was the notification I sent to the boutique Sarah managed. Since I owned the commercial space through a holding company, I issued a formal notice of intent to sell the property. Sarah had spent years playing business owner while I subsidized the overhead and covered the losses. Without my support, her boutique was a house of cards waiting for a light breeze. I watched the read receipts pop up on my screen, knowing that miles away, the panic was escalating. Dominic, the international investor, was likely nowhere to be found when the actual bills came due. I sat back in my chair, the quiet of the studio apartment, feeling like a hard-earned victory. For the first time in a decade, I wasn't responsible for someone else's delusions. I was just a man with a clean ledger and a future that belonged entirely to himself. By late Tuesday afternoon, the digital paper trail Arthur Sterling had been chasing finally reached its end, and the results were more devastating than I had anticipated. I sat in a secluded corner of a quiet bistro near Capitol Square, the rain beginning to streak the windows as Arthur's voice crackled through my phone. He wasn't just my lawyer. He was a man who dealt in the cold, hard currency of truth, and he had spent the last 8 hours peeling back the layers of Dominic Vance's supposed international empire. "Mitchell," Arthur began, his tone weary but professional, "your international venture capitalist doesn't own a vineyard in Tuscany. In fact, he doesn't even own the suit he wore to the engagement party. It was rented using a credit card that was reported stolen 3 days ago in Maryland. The investigation had revealed a labyrinth of shell companies and unpaid judgments stretching from Miami to Jersey City. Dominic wasn't a man of wealth. He was a professional predator who specialized in reconnecting with estranged family members just as they were about to marry into money. His target wasn't actually Paige, it was Julian's family. He had spent months grooming Paige, filling her head with dreams of European villas, specifically so he could gain access to the Julian's legal network. He had already approached Julian's father, a senior partner at a top-tier Richmond firm, with a ground-floor investment opportunity in a fictitious green energy startup. Dominic was planning to use the wedding as a backdrop to secure a 6-figure wire transfer before vanishing back into the shadows. "There's more," Arthur continued, the sound of flipping pages audible over the line. "Dominic has 3 active warrants for interstate fraud. He's been living out of high-end hotels on the East Coast, racking up massive bills and leaving just before the authorities arrive. He saw Paige as his golden ticket, a way to embed himself into Virginia's upper crust and find fresh victims. The designer handbag he gave her? It's a counterfeit, Mitchell. A high-quality knockoff, purchased from a street vendor in New York. I felt a strange sense of vindication, but it was hollow. My 12 years of honest, hard-earned stability had been discarded for a man who was essentially a ghost made of lies and stolen identities. I asked Arthur if we should alert the authorities or the Julian family immediately. He paused, the silence on the line heavy with legal calculation. "Not yet," he advised. "If we interfere now, Paige and Sarah will frame you as the jealous villain trying to sabotage her happiness. Let the reality of his financial void do the work for us. The hotel manager has already contacted the police about the unpaid $15,000 banquet bill." Dominic is currently trapped at the Jefferson because his investor credit cards are all declining. He's trying to charm his way out, but the staff there has seen his type before. They've locked the doors. I ended the call and stared at the rain-slicked streets of Richmond. I had the power to save them from the impending disaster, to pay the bill and expose Dominic before he ruined their reputations forever. But then I remembered Paige's cold, transactional whisper in the hallway, how she had relegated me to a utility and mocked my professional standing. She had chosen the glitter over the gold, the lie over the life we had built. I realized that some lessons can only be learned in the wreckage of one's own making. I decided to remain a ghost. I would let the real dad handle the fallout of his own lifestyle. As the evening lights flickered on across the city, I felt a profound sense of detachment. The man who had once stayed up until dawn to proofread Paige's essays was gone. In his place was a man who was simply waiting for the inevitable collapse of a structure built on sand. 3 weeks after the echoes of the engagement toast faded, the Richmond social circle did what it does best. It purged the outsiders. The fall of Paige's carefully constructed future happened with the clinical precision of a demolition crew. Julian's father, a man whose reputation was built on vetting the integrity of his associates, had wasted no time once the police arrived at the Jefferson Hotel to question Dominic Vance. The discovery of the interstate fraud warrants and the stolen credit cards was the final gavel strike. Julian had sent a courier to my house in Richmond, with a brief, typed note and a returned engagement ring. The Julian family didn't do scandals, they did disappearances. They wiped Paige from their lives as if she were a clerical error in a legal brief, leaving her with a closet full of non-refundable bridesmaids' dresses and a mountain of unpaid vendor deposits. The night the locks were changed on the suburban house, a torrential rain was lashing against the windows of my modest new apartment in the city. I was sitting in the dark, watching the headlights of passing cars reflected on the ceiling, when the pounding on my door began. It wasn't the rhythmic knock of a guest. It was the frantic, rhythmic thud of someone drowning. When I opened it, Paige stood there, her blonde hair matted to her face, her expensive silk trench coat stained with street grime. Behind her, Sarah sat in the car, her face a mask of exhausted defeat. Paige didn't lead with an apology. She led with a demand, her voice cracking with a mixture of desperation and lingering arrogance. "Mitchell, you have to stop this." The bank froze everything. They took the house, they locked Mom out of the boutique, and Julian won't even take my calls. "You need to call Arthur Sterling and fix this right now." I leaned against the doorframe, my arms crossed, feeling a strange, hollow stillness where my heart used to race for her safety. "Fix what, Paige?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper against the thunder. "The fact that your real father is currently in a county jail cell awaiting extradition? Or the fact that you traded 12 years of stability for a man who didn't even know your middle name?" She flinched, the first sign of real cracks in her armor. She tried to step into the apartment, but I didn't move. I remained a physical barrier between my new life and her chaos. "We have nowhere to go," she sobbed, finally dropping the facade. "Mom is staying in a motel, and I'm being sued for the banquet bill. You're my dad, Mitchell. You can't just let us end up on the street. It's not fair." I looked at her, really looked at her, and remembered the little girl who used to be afraid of the dark. But that girl was gone, replaced by the woman who had tried to erase me to impress a family of strangers. I leaned in, mimicking the exact distance she had kept during her whisper in the hallway. "Do you remember what you told me at the Jefferson, Paige?" I asked, watching her eyes widen as the memory hit her like a physical blow. "You told me I was a provider, not a parent. You told me to stay in the shadows and know my place. Well, this is my place. It's a place where I no longer pay for the privilege of being insulted." She reached out to grab my hand, her fingers trembling, but I pulled away. There was no anger left, only a profound, icy exhaustion. "I messaged Julian's father today," I said, watching her face light up with a flicker of false hope. "But not to save you. I sent him the full ledger of every dollar I spent on your education and your lifestyle, along with the legal proof that I am not, and never have been, your legal guardian. I made sure they knew that your debts are yours alone. You wanted to be a Vance, Paige. Now you get to see exactly what that name is worth in this town." I didn't wait for her response. I didn't look at Sarah, who was now crying in the driveway. I simply closed the door and turned the deadbolt, the sound of the metal clicking into place being the final punctuation mark on a decade of wasted devotion. 6 months have passed since the night the deadbolt clicked shut, and the landscape of my life in Richmond has been completely re-engineered. I no longer spend my Saturday mornings reviewing tuition statements or checking the balance of a boutique's commercial lease. Instead, I sit on the balcony of my new apartment overlooking the James River, drinking coffee that I bought for myself, in a home where my presence is no longer a utility to be managed. The silence isn't lonely. It is the sound of a debt finally paid not in dollars, but in self-respect. I realized that for 12 years, I wasn't just building a family. I was building a pedestal for people who were only waiting for a chance to kick it out from under me. The fallout for Paige and Sarah was as clinical as a foreclosure notice. Dominic Vance is currently serving a 4-year sentence in a federal correctional facility for a string of wire fraud charges across the East Coast. He didn't have a vineyard, he didn't have investors, and he certainly didn't have a plan to save his daughter. He was a professional parasite who had simply run out of hosts. When the Julian family's legal team finished their investigation, they made sure Paige's name was blacklisted from every high society circle in Virginia. The girl who once looked down on my limited engineering mindset found herself facing a reality where her Ivy League degree was overshadowed by a scorched credit score and a reputation for being the daughter of a con artist. I heard through Arthur Sterling that Sarah is now living in a small, one-bedroom rental on the outskirts of the city, working as a sales associate in a department store, the very kind of job she used to think was beneath her when I was paying the bills for her boutique. Paige, the woman who whispered that I should stay in the shadows, is now working double shifts at a local diner to pay off the interest on the student loans I refused to continue backing. There was no grand redemption, no cinematic moment of realization where they came to me with genuine hearts. They only came when they were hungry, and when I stopped being a source of nourishment, they finally stopped circling. The most powerful revenge wasn't the financial ruin I visited upon them. It was my total and absolute indifference. I didn't check their social media. I didn't respond to the desperate emails Sarah sent during the holidays, and I didn't attend any of the legal hearings regarding the hotel debt. I simply moved on. I took the money I would have spent on a $300,000 wedding and donated a significant portion to a scholarship fund for students who actually value the opportunity to learn. I started hiking again, rediscovering the trails I had abandoned because I was too busy working overtime to fund someone else's delusions of grandeur. Some people might call my exit cold, but in America, loyalty is a currency, and I had spent my entire life savings on a bad investment. I learned that you cannot buy a seat at a table where you aren't truly welcome, and you certainly shouldn't pay for the napkins while being insulted. As I watch the river flow toward the Atlantic, I feel a lightness I haven't known since I was 30. I am Mitchell, not a provider, not a proxy, and certainly not a ghost in my own home. I am a man who chose himself, and that is a victory that no whisper in a hallway can ever take away. The story didn't end with a real dad saving the day. It ended with a real man saving his own soul.